Hi everyone, I'm Lisa. I'm going to take you through the Angoff Standard Setting process today. We are going to have a look at what the Angoff method is, how we use it to set a standard, who it is that we're setting the standard for, and then have a look at the practical steps of standard setting at Birmingham Medical School. So the Angoff method is named after William Angoff. The original version was proposed back in 1971, so quite an old method now, and there are a lot of variations. The underlying format of it is probably the most common method that we see in standard setting. It's very defensible, and there's a lot of logic behind how we arrive at a standard. It's what we would call a criterion reference method, by which I mean it defines a minimal requirement to pass a test, but it's independent of the scores that we see in that test. So what makes it defensible is that it uses a panel of judges. So it's not one person, it's lots of opinions on questions. And because it's set independent of the scores that we see, any number of students can pass or fail. So the thing at the heart of this is the idea of what is minimally competent, and the pass mark that we set reflects that point. So in Angoff's own words, and this is taken directly from that 1971 publication, we ask each judge to state the probability that the minimally acceptable person would answer each item correctly. In effect, the judges would think of a number of minimally acceptable persons instead of only one such person, and would estimate the proportion of minimally acceptable persons who would answer each item correctly. And the sum of these probabilities or proportions would then represent the minimally acceptable score. Except actually we do that for a range of judges, and we use the average of all of their scores to come up with that minimally acceptable score as a consensus between what are our content and our subject matter experts. So at the heart of this is defining what we think of as being minimally competent. So the questions to ask yourself is, what does competent look like for this assessment? It's someone who is borderline but safe. So someone who very just meets the competency standard, and it's essentially the lowest standard that would still pass the exam, but by the absolute thinnest of margins. So if they got any lower than the score that you set, they would fail the assessment. So what to avoid here is that they are not an average person. We're not looking for an average, and we're not looking for someone who's failed. So obviously it's that sweet spot of finding someone who is borderline, but on the safe side of borderline, the worst person who you would still allow to practice, who you would still consider to be competent, but the very worst. And any lower, they would fail. So there's a couple of key concepts there, but at the heart of that is this idea of what is minimally competent. It's the absolute, I say, the worst person that would still pass the assessment. So the Angoff process is slightly different for MCQs and SAQs, and in these we are thinking of, for MCQs, we think of maybe 10 minimally competent students, and we're asking ourselves what proportion of those 10 students would answer the question correctly. And that's an important thing, that it's which of them would answer it, not could or should, because that will come to a very different conclusion. So we're looking at the 10 minimally competent students. How many of those 10 would answer the question correctly? What you should see is that easier questions, straightforward questions, will have higher scores. So you might mark an easy question as 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. We tend not to have very, very high scoring questions because they don't really add anything to the data, although one or two inevitably always get through. Harder and more complex questions will have lower scores. And it's just worth bearing in mind that for a multiple choice test with 5 options, if you were to guess at it and not be cued by the question, you would expect 20% of those who are guessing to get a question correct. So 20% is probably the lower end, so that's 2 out of 10. But that's kind of the way to look at it is how many of our 10 students would answer the question correctly. For SAQs, it's slightly different. So for SAQs, what we want to do is think of a single minimally competent student and ask what score would that student achieve on that question. Again, easy, straightforward questions would have higher scores, and harder, more complex items will have lower scores. In this case, there is no room for guessing, because you have to know what you're talking about. One way to approach this is to look at the score that you've given it, reduce it by 1, and ask yourself if someone would still be, whether you'd still be happy to pass someone as competent with that score. And if the answer is yes, then go down again, and until you find that point at which you are at that, again, at that borderline where you are just passing someone on that question. So the practical steps that we'll get you to go through. You'll get an email and you'll be sent links to each of the exams we'd like you to review, and we'll send you a spreadsheet in which to record your scores. So the first thing, and I can't stress how important this is, please type your name in the yellow box. We'll tell you which cell it is. Just before you type in any scores or comments, it's really useful to know who our scores are by. Each row will tell you whether the question is an MCQ or an SAQ, and it will tell you what we're scoring out of. But what we want you to do is to look at the 2 columns at the end, so the score and the comments. Add a score out of 10 for each question, and add any comments that you have about the question, the quality of it, or anything that you want to raise. It's a way of providing a bit of feedback to us about what you think of the questions, if you want to do that. For MCQs and SAQs, in both cases, we're looking for scores out of 10. When you've finished, you can also check your own pass marks. So you can do that by calculating the average. There is an example of an Excel formula here. So you would type equals average and then put in the range of scores that you wanted to average. And what that's telling you is, on those questions, that average score is what you would set the pass mark to. In fact, so because we're marking out of 10, if your average is 5, that means that your pass mark is 50%. If your average is 5.5, it means it's 55%. So then have a look at those questions that you've done the standard setting for and ask yourself, is that too high or is that too low? And if you aren't happy with that, go back and review your scores. So if you've got a very high or a very low score overall, it probably needs a bit of fine-tuning. Most of our questions are designed to test people around the borderline level. So we'll see a lot of scores that are probably somewhere in the middle. But yeah, if it's too high or if it's too low, go back, have a think about it until your average and your pass mark is something that you are happy with. When you've finished, return the sheets to us, and if there are any questions where there is wide disagreement, or there are any issues with questions, or we have a few more questions for you to have a look at, we will be in touch and follow up with that. But at that point, hopefully, that's the end of the process that we ask you to be involved in. If anyone is interested, there are some questions here, so you can always pause this video now and just take a look at any of these papers, which describe a bit more about the process of standard setting. And finally, if you have any questions, please send us an email to the assessments inbox. That's particularly with things like Speedwell. If you have any issues working Speedwell, or you aren't sure what to do, or you have any other questions about standard setting, please get in touch and let us know. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording now. Thank you.